That's great. Everybody's in silence, so it's a moment to start. Yeah, that's my cue. So welcome. I'm Sergio Lazzarini. I'm an academic vice president of Insper. It's our great honor to have this to host this event here. Since 2023, Insper and the Becker Friedman Institute for Economics have this partnership. It is an amazing opportunity to have insights for economic research, policy analysis, and also interaction between scholars, right? Have many scholars here and presenting their research. Is part of the Becker Institute effort in Latin America, which is also great, right? That we're part of this community. Many thanks to the Haddad Foundation for the support, and this is part of a broader collaboration between Insper and University of Chicago. And as a matter of fact, we have historical ties, right? Because our founder, Claudio Haddad, and actually Tanya, right? Our president of our board, who is here. They are alumni. Also, Rodrigo Soares, as a PhD from the University of Chicago, but it's it's a wonderful program, right? Of course. So, and I was talking to Tanya that all this experience of Chicago also inspired Insper for this kind of in this track of excellence. So in a sense, we have Chicago here in our roots, and also we had always the privilege to have José Alexandre Schenkman, right, who was a former faculty of the University Department of Economics, and who continues to help us here in several activities, including our knowledge committee and external evaluation committee. Ed Baird also, also former right faculty member there. So and therefore, so we have, as I said, we have several ties. So, and it's a real honor to host here several well-known academics, and in particular, right, Professor Lars Hansen. All those scholars do not need introductions, but anyway, right? David Rockefeller, distinguished service professor of the University of Chicago, Department of Economics, Statistics, and the Booth School. He was the recipient, as we all know, of the Nobel Prize in Economics 2013, working in macroeconomics, finance, and statistics, and also we have the privilege to have here with us Leonardo Burstein, Sayer Family Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago, editor of the Journal of Political Economy, co-director of the Becker Friedman Institute, and the program in behavioral economics research, studying individual decision-making, behavioral, social environment using field experiments and data. They both came to Insper before, right? So it's really happy to have them back here. Okay, thank you so much for your presence here. It'll be an excellent event. I'll be here for the keynote, and thank you all.
Good evening. My name is Ben Krause. I'm the executive director of the Becker Friedman Institute for Economics at the University of Chicago. I just wanted to start by thanking again the Haddad Foundation and our colleagues here at Insper for this incredible collaboration that we've been building over the past several years. The Becker Friedman Institute serves as a hub for the more than 200 economists on campus across a half dozen different units, all bringing them together to advance both frontier research and global impact. And we really have, I would say, kindred spirits here at Insper, not only because we shared the classroom together with so many of you, or at least so many of your professors and leaders here, but also because we're committed to transforming the world. I know that here at Insper, you're committed to transforming Brazil by advancing leadership and academic study and rigor. And it's the similar thing for us at Becker Friedman Institute for Economics. We're continuously looking for opportunities to establish virtuous cycles of evidence informing policy decision in the public, private, and social sectors, and then creating partnerships with those decision makers, with researchers and the scholars at our university to create ever more rigorous and relevant evidence for the priorities and contexts in which we're working. I could think of no better people to bring to campus than Lars and Leo and several other of our scholars, because their work really demonstrates the kind of impact that we can have in the world when we engage with the tools of economics and the challenges that our world is facing. And so, in order to present Lars formally to the stage, I have the honor of presenting Emanuele Colinelli. He is the professor of finance and entrepreneurship at the Booth School of Business. He's also the co-director of the Becker Friedman Institute Latin America program. And he has been the incredible fire and passion behind bringing this entire conference together. So let me invite Emanuele.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Way too kind. I'm here between you and Lars, so I'm going to be quick. Also, I feel like Sergio did already like a very good introduction to Lars. I wanted to say maybe a couple of notes first on why we're here, at least from my perspective. So I think if I think back about my PhD years when I was at Stanford and I was thinking about doing research, I remember I was very interested in this wonderful Brazilian data, Brazilian settings that to me remind me a lot about the screwed up local politics in Italy, which then I learned it's screwed up everywhere. But the point is, I was very interested in that. And at that point, it was very hard to actually, as an Italian, do research in other contexts, certainly in a context like Brazil. And so I remember a meeting with Marcio Garcia, if some of you might know. He was visiting Stanford those years. And Marcio was like, oh, I'll introduce you to some big name in the central bank. Then he made that introduction. That introduction led to another introduction. And 2 years that I spent of my life trying to get one introduction to the next to understand the context, get the data, and so on and so forth. And of course, 10 years afterwards, I've been working a lot in Brazil. I feel it's an amazing context, and I feel very happy about the whole course of action. But we're here to try to make that process a bit simpler. And I think with what we're doing with BFI and Insper, it's probably the best representation of that we have. It's a top institution. It's a top institution both in the US and in Brazil. And we're doing a lot already, even though it started just now. So this is a conference to say we have to bridge a bit more the gap. I'm speaking to many of you, the students, because I think you guys are all important in the front rows, but I think the students are the ones that should benefit from this the most. We want to create a way for you to be more involved. I benefited a lot from this. So one of my current pre-docs, who's a superstar, is an Insper student who came to work with me. People who are now colleagues of many of you guys are people who I work with and I continuously work with. So very happy. I think there is a lot of talent here. There is a lot of talent there. There is a lot of ideas that can cross-pollinate. So that's essentially why we're here. And so tomorrow we're going to have a conference where we're going to have some highlights of people that have some affiliations with the BFI Insper program, but not only. So we're going to also have, for example, discussants from other amazing institutions in Brazil. So the idea is we want to build this both with BFI, with UChicago, but also with everything else that comes in the ecosystem. So you should come tomorrow if you have time. Just quick housekeeping before I get to Lars. We're going to have a talk for about 1 hour, but we're going to keep 50 minutes at the end to do Q&A. So let's hold off questions, if that's okay with Lars, and then we ask questions towards the end. With Lars, I would like to make very long introductions. It's hard. It's a very long CV. The few things I could learn quickly was that his birthday is coming up on Sunday. So if you can convince him to stay a few more days, we can have another celebration where, I don't know what, I know Lars skis. I don't think we can ski much in this area today, but we'll see. Lars is also, I guess, a perfect person to do this. Lars has been, again, I should have known. Lars is a colleague of mine, a much more accomplished colleague of mine, but he's been with UChicago for 44 years. That's a lot of years to be an institution by himself. He was the first director, the person who led the Friedman Institute when he got started, which Lars reminded me this morning was much less glamorous than the BFI today, because he had 2/3 of a person that made up the institute. or something like that. And of course, he's a good friend of Claudio Haddad. When I asked him to come here, so my job was easy. My job was to basically be the coach who picks the good players. Once you have the good players, you typically win. We can talk about other things. And so when I asked Lars to do this, he was like, I would love to, because actually I love Insper. It doesn't say friend, he said I'm a good acquaintance of Claudio, but I think he's a good friend that he wanted to sort of like come very much energized to do this. So he's a good person for this in many reasons. He's also a very unique person at UChicago. In particular, he's a very, very kind human being, which sometimes not always the case for every economics-related person at UChicago. But so with all of that, welcome Lars Hansen to the stage, who's going to be talking to us about climate change uncertainty. Thank you, Lars, and thanks, everyone. The most important thing, thanks to Yasmin, Michelle, who unfortunately is not here, and Luisa for all that's happening, because all of this is actually your work, not ours. Thanks again.
So the initial Friedman Institute was remarkable and glamorous. I have to take strong exception to the characterization. It's my privilege to be here, and I'm going to be talking across kind of a line of research that I've been working on. It's interconnected in some very important ways, and it's almost by necessity interdisciplinary, and it involves collaborators with a variety of different expertises. I'm going to be talking about climate change uncertainty and its implications for two things. One is for investment in new technologies, and the other is for reforestation, which is, of course, a well-known topic here in Brazil. I've listed a subset of my collaborators that the substantive parts of this are going to be connected to research I've done with Mike Barnett and Buzz Brock, with Giuliano and Jose. Then our rainforest work, and then I have my Italian connection for decision theory, and then some other top scholars and Sargent Suganidi. So it's really helpful to bring lots of people to bear to discuss this subject. So let me get started here. In a lot of policy discussions, uncertainty gets pushed to the wayside. People don't want to talk about it. They want to put it. They view it as second-order consideration. There's concerns that if we talk about uncertainty in policy, it'll just lead to not wanting to do anything. And so I want to very much argue against that perspective and saying that's a misunderstanding. And I want to make the case for why it's valuable to put uncertainty in the forefront instead of just leaving it off the table. Now, as economists, we're trained to think about trade-offs. That seems to be what one of our key things we like to talk about. And for uncertainty, there's two trade-offs that come to mind. One is if I'm going to be using models. Policy making is not just evidence-based. The best policymakers occur in dynamic setups, and it's the interaction between models and evidence that becomes central. So when we use models, we can use them to make best guesses. Okay? Just give us your best guess, and that's how they're often used in policy making. The other one you can use, and this showed up in some of the uses during of models. During COVID, but not always clarified, is potentially bad outcomes. I can use the models to say, well, if I adopt this policy, what could go wrong? Okay? Now, if I put everything on best guesses, there may be a non-trivial chance that something could go wrong that I'm basically ignoring. If I only focus on bad outcomes, I just give up. I just don't get up in the morning. Things are hopeless because so the real question is, how do I go in between these two? And that's a trade-off. The other one is, do we act now or do we wait till we learn more? So we're facing a world with uncertainty. We're in a dynamic environment. Evidence is going to come down the road. Maybe we eventually we understand and resolve the uncertainties in ways that are different than today. Maybe we should just wait. But for some policy problems, I think climate change is an example. it's much cheaper for society to act now under the possibility of some very bad outcomes, as opposed to waiting until we're really sure that those bad outcomes are going to be realized, in which case it may be very, very costly or close to impossible to do stuff about. So again, there's a trade-off now between these two. Okay? So these trade-offs are kind of in the back of it, are connected to the agenda that I want to be talking about. Okay. So here I just produced a quote from a somewhat recent paper in Nature. The economic consequences of many of the complex risks associated with climate change cannot, however, be currently quantified. Now, I would modify that. I would say fully quantified. These unquantified, poorly understood, and often deeply uncertain risks can and should be in economic evaluations of decision-making processes. So I agree with this statement, and our research is trying to address this. This paper doesn't. This paper goes on and characterizes the uncertainties, but it doesn't produce a framework for how to think about these so-called deep uncertainties. But within some type of some discussions, the term deep uncertainty shows up, and the question is how we kind of make it operational, or even what we mean by it. So here's the thing that I would say haunts me. It keeps me up at night sometimes. So Hayek, when he won the Nobel Prize, he shared it with Myrdal. And I think it was not the, Hayek and Myrdal are very, very different. It was kind of an awkward combination, I'm sure, to both participants. So when you win the Nobel Prize, you're charged with writing an essay that's supposed to explain all the great things you did to get this Nobel Prize. Of course, often the research has been done much earlier. It's a boring thing to do, and so people might spend a little bit of time on that. But they use this as an opportunity to give a more updated perspective on, say, research and the like. So Hayek wrote this very interesting essay. It's really a fascinating read. I disagree with lots of it. He says that mathematics is only useful as a language of clarity, that quantitative analysis in economics has led us nowhere, that econometrics, a field that I have some sympathy with, has accomplished nothing in decades. So he's kind of harsh on certain aspects of quantitative research. But this statement here kind of resonates, and I think it's a very interesting one, that even if true scientists should recognize the limits of studying human behavior, as long as the public has expectations, there'll be people who pretend or believe they can do more to meet popular demand than what is really in their power. And so this is, when you think about uncertainty in policy, I think this is part of the motivation here. How can we talk about policy, about scientific inputs into it, and be true to what our real knowledge base is? I mean, we don't know everything. There's some places where things are sparse or the like, and how can we integrate that into policymaking? And you see this in both scientific influences on policy, but you also see it in economists. Economists will go in policymaking setups, and one economist will assert with great confidence this is an outcome, and then a different one will assert with great confidence there's some other outcome, and presumably these confidences are just ways to try to influence policy, and not a true statement of what the nature of our understanding is. So I think, to me, addressing this type of concern of Hayek's, I think, is very important. Okay, so I'm going to be, through my talk, I'm going to be going back and forth with two examples. And these examples are kind of really, in some sense, complementary, but also quite, very, very different. The first one is going to be a very highly stylized model of climate change, and then talking about uncertainty in policy. And a key thing that we're going to put on the table that is remarkably missing in a lot of discussions of things like the social cost of carbon and climate change is green technology investment, and the fact that sometimes these climate economics models will have some type of exogenous technological change taking place. But the notion that one of the policy levers we might have is to encourage or nurture more green technology investment, even if the payoffs are decades down the road, and even if they're highly uncertain. So my work with Barnett and Brock is kind of about, it's kind of Mike and Buzz is about that. The other one I want to talk about is uncertain land productivity in the Amazon rainforest. And this is some work I've done with Giuliano and Jose. And I'm coming back to this, but the question there is you've got different plots of land in the Amazon. They have different amounts of productivity for two different activities, growing trees or agriculture. Okay? How much we know about those productivities? Land's used for often used for one purpose or the other one. So we have to make some to analyze this question. We have to do calculations that tell us about potential productivities and changing land usages. And so uncertainty kind of can play an important role in that problem as well. So I'll be coming back to both of these. So let me talk about, here's the climate model, but this is a model under which we can address these issues of endogenous investment in new technologies. So this is, the models from an economic standpoint is going to be quite simple. There's going to be some type of capital that's broadly based capital that's typically in our macro models. There's going to be some fossil fuel based energy which is going to be used to enhance production, but also to cause climate change. Temperature then, that induced by the emissions, is going to induce damages to the production. It's you have the consumption good, or it could be overall production, or say overall output of the economy. So there's going to be some type of notion of as you warm the climate system, it's going to have ramifications for economic opportunities that are adverse. So within this model, then you could you think about consumption, the basic consumption now. It's going to be diminished. The value of that consumption is going to be diminished by global warming, say. But there's going to be investment in new capital. But there's also going to be investment in research and development. That's going to increase the stock of knowledge. As I increase this stock of knowledge, then that's going to increase the chances of developing or designing new technologies that down the road can be economically viable. One example that we try to trot out here, because we're thinking here about long-term uncertainties, is nuclear fusion. Now, when I mentioned this with a little bit of hesitation because it's remarkably controversial even within the physics community. I've talked to eminent physicists who will tell me that nuclear fusion, within 30 years is going to be really a big success story for producing clean energy. To other ones telling me that this is not going to be economically viable anytime in the very near, anytime in over many decades. There's lots of uncertainty about its payoff, but is this the type of activity just because we're uncertain about it, do we not want to do it? And so that's kind of that's a question I want to introduce, that I want to be exploring. So I want to explore what prudent choices are for investment and the energy input. The prudent choices for investment and energy input are going to depend on so-called marginal valuations, which I'll talk about. And the marginal valuations that show up in discussions of climate change, the one that's common is the so-called social cost of carbon, or more generally the social cost of climate change. The other one is the social value of research and development. So when we think about, as economists, when we think about working out what are prudent ways to go, we often compute these, what are the incremental values of making additional investments of these different types. And so there's those type of measurements come to the forefront. So there's going to be two policy levers in this kind of base overall climate model. There's going to be reduce fossil fuel emissions or invest in the discovery of these new technologies that are clean replacements. Okay. So what are the uncertainties in this setup? Well, the setup has four types of uncertainties. One is the usual one that economists will talk about in stochastic growth models. Capital investment today is going to alter future output. Okay. We have so-called technology shocks. Another one is the geoscientific one. If I omit carbon in the atmosphere today, it's going to impact the future climate. We show in our paper that that if you look across a whole menu of climate models, and so what people will do with those models is to do model comparisons. They'll run these so-called pulse experiments. Suppose you take some baseline and you increase the amount of emissions, and then these complex models that they give these experiments to a whole bunch of model builders, and they ask them, so what does your model tell us about it? There's lots of similarity in the patterns that come out. Roughly speaking, temperature rises over the course of the next decade and then kind of levels out. but it levels out to different places depending upon the model. Now, this is not fair to geosciences because I'm thinking about long-term as an economist. For an economist, if we're building models 40 and 50 years out, that's long-term. For a geoscientist, that's like that's still that's moderately term. They will crank their models out for many, many centuries in order to actually understand the dynamics. So what I characterize the dynamics there, over longer time scales, a bunch of other things happen. Okay, then there's the economic side. Climate change is going to change, it's going to alter future economic opportunities and social well-being. Now, we can say that, well, yeah, we're in a data-rich economy. Just go look at it, go pick data, and that should tell us about this. But remember, we're pushing economies into places they haven't, potentially into places they haven't experienced. The historical data is going to be of somewhat limited value. There's going to be a lot of kind of modeling, and model-based speculation about trying to figure out what it's going to do to economic opportunities down the road. Then the final one is this technology one, whereby if I invest in research and development today, it's going to eventually lead to, may say, an economically viable technologies, but over what time horizon and might that happen? So how about the rainforest setup? So in the rainforest setup, we're going to think about allocating land to two uses: agriculture. Okay, so there's a private return there. You can kind of graze cows. You can go look at beef prices and the like. Okay, and this typically emits carbon dioxide. And then there's forest. We can kind of grow. We can grow more trees. That's going to absorb more carbon. Now, the agriculture activity right now has a non-trivial private return, and that's why there's lots of agriculture going on. The forest growth is a lot of that's a social return, and so we have to think about issues about potentially to incentivize it. Right? Now in our model, we build the spatial dynamic model. We have these like over 1,000 locations in the Brazilian Amazon, and then we want to see how policy affects their allocation over time and space. Okay. So we have to impose costs on reallocating land. We can't just immediately shift land from forest to agriculture without some type of cost. And the other one is the price of carbon emissions, whereas in the previous paper, that would be the previous model that was determined endogenously. Here what we're doing is we're imposing different prices of these carbon emissions and trying to see how far, for these different external prices of carbon emissions, how much you have to push it before you really change the prudent allocation of land in the Amazon. So I talked about this about uncertainty and deep uncertainty and the like. There's a big literature, there's a non-trivial literature in economics, decision theory, and it's related insights in control theory and in statistical decision theory. It develops, justifies approaches that are so-called rational or prudent. Rational in a concept, in a setup where you have these uncertainties that are arguably complex, it's not quite clear how you want to define that. Different papers have different axiomatic systems, and the formalizations turn out to be different. So I actually prefer the term prudent to rational in this context. But some of this research allows for a broad perspective on uncertainty. So I find the following categorization to be useful in this context. A lot of macro models, when we introduce uncertainty, we do it with kind of shocks with known distributions. And when we teach microeconomics, we teach about risk aversion. Risk aversion are a case in which you know probabilities but not outcomes. Coin flips, you roll dice and the like. In rational expectations macroeconomics, we pretend people know all the probabilities, it's just not the outcomes of which are uncertainty. So that's one type of uncertainty. And that's the one that economists really study, and people in finance as well have studied the most. There's another one that that statisticians have wrestled with for a long time, and suppose you have multiple probability models. This could include unknown parameters or the like. Which among these multiple probability models is best? So that requires some type of subjective input. some type of so-called prior uncertainty. Now, if the data is super rich, you can say, well, the data is just going to tell me which is the right model, and that resolves it. But in a lot of these setups, the data is not that rich. And so the data doesn't tell you this is the model. And there's multiple models that should be that potentially should be under consideration. And I think this is very relevant for climate change. So that puts on this notion of this subjective or prior uncertainty, and then how can I address that? How do I explore that prior uncertainty? The third way, and this is maybe the hardest one to wrestle with, and actually might be the most important. When we write down a model in economics, it's true in other scientific disciplines, it's going to give flawed probabilistic predictions. We can't write down a model that's going to explain a complex reality. It's just not going to work. It's just not going to be useful, and we don't know how to do it. We write down models with simplifications. So and they provide us insights. They're deliberate simplifications. Okay? But that means that in some formal sense, they're misspecified. So towards statistical language, it'd be like likelihood uncertainty. And so how do we use models in sensible ways, acknowledging the fact that there's this misspecification? Now, when we teach econometrics classes, when we teach statistics classes, we don't really talk about much about this, except in ways that are often not quite so useful. Yet, I think it's a tremendously important challenge when we actually want to use models for policymaking. So this decision theory encodes preferences of these different type of aversions to uncertainty. And that's going to be important in our research. Okay. So here's some quotes from two famous statisticians, Box and Cox. There's a bunch of other quotes I got to lift as well, but since all models are wrong, the scientists must be alert to what's importantly wrong. It comes from Box. The word model implies simplification and idealization. The construction of idealized representation that capture important stable aspects. It's a vital part of scientific analysis, but it's not meant to be a full description of reality. So this is the misspecification concern. So I and others have been drawing insights from various different disciplines and kind of trying to work through so-called axiomatic approaches to thinking about these issues. And I've just listed some of our recent research in this direction. Okay, so what are the so-called risks in this climate model? So we're going to adopt two convenient models of risk. One is so-called Brownian motion. Just think about these as normally distributed shocks, okay? And in some sense, that relatively small ones, okay? So the model might be highly nonlinear, but there's these normally distributed shocks. They hit things repeatedly. So that's one type. The other type that's going to be important in our calculations are, I'm going to call them Poisson events. They're discrete, one-off events. They're going to do things like capture, at some point in time, we see some big impacts on the climate system, and that adds to our recognition of how important climate change is for damages. Or we make this technological discovery. That technological discovery then, down the road, then allows us to address climate change with clean technologies. So we can write down these as full probability models, and that's typically done, but both types. But we want to relax the full confidence in those specifications. We want to write down probabilities, but we want to allow them to just be approximations or not quite right. And that's where these so-called robustness concerns come into play. And that's kind of a key part of this uncertainty challenge that we confront. So the uncertain abrupt changes in our climate economics example are, one is a type of, lots of discussion of so-called tipping points. First, a tipping point is kind of this realization in the future where something dramatic happens that now we know a lot more about the potential damages to climate change going forward as we continue to warm the earth more and more. So these tipping points are going to be triggered by warming. We're going to, as we warm, and then sooner or later, there's going to be this vent that gives rise to this recognition. This allows us to treat this one trade-off between acting now versus waiting. I could wait until this tipping point kicks in, and then I know a lot more about damages, or I can act now. And there's a trade-off between these two. The other is this technological breakthrough. I'm going to take a very simplified version of a technology breakthrough. We're going to make this discovery that's going to eliminate the need for dirty energy input. Now, these type of big events have things that we call intensities. They're measuring the likelihood of these events happening. And there's well-known ways to model them and the like. These intensities then are going to depend on decisions. So the intensity of a tipping point is going to depend on how much we warm the Earth. The intensity of the technology breakthrough is going to depend on how much we invest in this, say, research and development, and then say enhance the knowledge stock. So there's this endogeneity that interacts with these big events is very central to what we're doing. So what are the subjective uncertainties in the rainforest? Two examples. Okay, we got agricultural productivity. We've got some data we've got on measuring how productive agriculture is across different type of land types. We want to use that. We also have carbon capture productivity. How effectively with this, if we reallocate this land, what could be used for carbon capture? So here we're going to use so-called Bayesian methods to come up with these estimates of these productivities, but we want to make robust adjustments to them because these Bayesian estimates require very specific subjective inputs, and we want to kind of push away from those and allow for a little bit more flexibility in terms of their interpretation. We don't want to necessarily buy into literally into all the subjective inputs going in their construction. So our research has three different complementary extensions to what shows up in the scientific disciplines as uncertainty quantification. Uncertainty quantification occurs in lots of disciplines that say, well, we're going to go out and measure how the uncertainty affects different things. In our setup, especially in the climate economics one fact in both of them, there's high dimensional uncertainties. The uncertainties are coming from a whole bunch of different channels here. So part of the question here is not only how big the uncertainties are, but where are they consequential. Sometimes you have big uncertainties, but in places that don't matter for the policy question. So part of what our analysis wants to do is figure out where they're most consequential. So that's where we kind of use our decision theory to help us do this. And what's going to come out of this is an uncertainty adjusted probability. We might go in with a baseline probability, our best guess of probability specifications, but there's going to be this because of our uncertainty aversion. There's going to be this uncertainty adjustment that gets made, and this is very central to our calculations. We'll also do the following. We're going to assess. Remember that climate economics example had four different channels of uncertainty. We might want to assess which one of those really matters. Do we care about all four, or does one really dominate the other ones? And the final one is prudent decisions. It's kind of standard economics through first order conditions and the like. They depend on marginal valuations, like the social cost of carbon, what the social returns to research and development, and the like. Okay? So these uncertainty adjustments also affect those marginal valuations, and so there's lots of research done on public finance and in environmental economics about measuring marginal valuations, and so this research shows you how to make adjustments to that integrate in the uncertainty concerns. So these uncertainty adjusted probabilities are central to what we're doing. We're going to borrow insights from derivative claims theory and from robust Bayesian theory to do. You have to do the following. Let's see if I got something out of order here. Okay, I'm going to have to talk you through one thing before this. So the way the decision theory gets implemented is the following. Imagine I start off with a problem where I'm just a decision maker trying to make a good decision. So we might write down some optimization problem or something in order to figure out what a good decision is. We're going to change that. What we're going to do is we're going to have these probabilistic inputs, but we're going to relax the confidence in those. The way we're going to do this is we're going to replace that maximization problem by this so-called, you're going to invent this additional person who's going to figure out, well, for that course of action, what could go wrong? It's going to be a minimization step, and the minimization is going to be set. It's going to be over alternative different probabilities that might occur. We do it through some type of penalization. We kind of penalize things that are far away from our baseline much more than ones that are close. So part of what comes out of the calculation is not only the prudent course of action, but you can also figure out this kind of minimization which supports it. And in fact, and typically what one can show is that under this minimization problem, the course of action would actually be optimal. But the key thing is that these probabilities that we're computing aren't your best guesses. These are adjustments you make because you're not fully confident in the model. Okay, so we're going to deduce those. Okay, and then we're going to look at those. We're going to calculate this. I'm going to show you some pictures of some of these, and that allows us to look at what these uncertainty adjustments are. And if the uncertainty adjustment looks crazy to the scientific community, that means that we've allowed for this minimizing player to do way too much. Whereas if they are potentially plausible, then that makes perfect sense to be looking at them. Now, what the minimization is going to do, though, is it's going to tell you which of these potential misspecifications matter. It's going to sift through all high dimensional problem. It's going to isolate. This is a place where the decision maker really cares about, and maybe more evidence, more work can be done to produce better evidence. Maybe we can rethink whether we got the right inputs or not. So this uncertainty adjusted probability is going to be really central to this. And as I say, there's a long kind of history in robust Bayesian decision theory that kind of uses a very similar construct. Right. So if we're going after this, what's the most important channel for uncertainty? And then the climate model, what we do is the following. We activate the uncertainty concerns one channel at a time. Productivity, geoscientific, economic damages, technology, those four. Okay? And then I activate them all simultaneously. And I figure out courses of action and the like. Now from that, you can kind of start figuring out which of these channels really matter to what the prudent course of action is. And it turns out, for particular models we look at, this uncertain technology kind of dominates. This, of course, depends on model inputs, but the uncertainty, but that channel really dominates, and that the one kind of takes over. Usually, economists think about the damage uncertainty might be really important, and this certainly can be. But here, the technology and this technology piece, which is often omitted, turns out to be very, very vital. Okay? And so our calculations allow us to do this by kind of solving these 4 different minimization problems, or 5 different minimization problems instead of 1. So again, it's just part of our toolkit. Now for the marginal evaluation, we're going to depict these prudent decisions as dependent on the marginal evaluations. These marginal evaluations we show, we build in insights from so-called asset pricing theory. We can think about the following. There's social payoffs to doing things like investments. Okay, there's investments in R&D. They're going to have a whole stream of social payoffs attached to them. If I start warming the earth, it's going to have a whole sequence of kind of these damages that go into play. We're going to look at those marginal type calculations there, but we're going to use these uncertainty adjusted probabilities in order to get there, which is typically off the table. And then so it's actually possible to think about these marginal evaluations as mathematically things that look just like asset prices. Asset prices, there's a price today, and there's some stochastic cash flow going forward. The stochastic cash flow are just these kind of marginal payoffs to making incremental changes in different policies. Okay. Now, once we've got this asset pricing representation, you can see all the sources, all the different sources that are going into this calculation, and open the doors just to some very interesting decompositions and representations of these measurements of these commonly used measurements of marginal evaluation. They allow us to think about how the state interactions. Usually, we're looking at these economic climate systems involve a whole bunch of states. There's the climate part, the economic part, the technology part. These states all interact. You can kind of figure out how important those interactions are and the like. Okay. And so these methods allow for local evaluation of suboptimal policies, but they also allow you to interpret optimal policies. So they have. And so the methodological justification here comes with my paper with PD expert Takasuganides. The application, though, that actually preceded the methodological justification came in the work I did with Buzz and Mike on this green technology uncertainty. Yeah. So back to the marginal evaluations of interest in this project with technology. There's 2 marginal evaluations that are relevant. What's the social cost of global warming, and what's the social value of research and development? Okay. And in the rainforest example, the marginal valuations are the two different land uses. I can allocate land today to agriculture. I can allocate land today to growing trees, and from there, those variables then have these endogenously determined valuations, and they feed into what you want to, how you want to do smart allocation of land. So here's just some pictures of these that come out of our analysis. So the first one gets in this trade-off between acting now versus waiting. So let's think about this Poisson event. This is a tipping point. The tipping point is going to tell us in the future we're going to figure out a lot more about how much we're going to damage the economy and damage economic opportunities. So right before the jump, I'm showing you the kind of distributions of the potential distributions of the investment in R&D given by that blue curve, by that blue density. I'm sorry. That's okay. But then after the jump, you all of a sudden know a whole bunch of stuff. You know about the different potential damages. You have much more information about how much you're going to hinder economic opportunities. It could be a lot. It could just be a little bit. It could be good news. If it's good news, you're going to be more on the left of the plot, and if it's bad news, you're going to be much more on the right. And so you get this bigger spread afterwards. So there is a trade-off between, there's a big change to this additional information, but you still want to reduce carbon emissions today. Even though down the road you'll make an even bigger adjustment when this tipping point gets realized. The impact on emissions is much more modest, and that's given by the right panel here. But here you'll see that there's right before the jump, it's the blue densities telling you the emissions recommendations, and then afterwards after you get this information, it's the red histogram that captures it. So this is kind of gives some sense of this acting now versus waiting. Now, here's uncertainty-adjusted probabilities. Let's remember technology. This technology uncertainty is the one that really takes over our calculations and dominates it. Okay, so now we're doing these uncertainty adjustments here. So let's start off with the blue density. Think about this is like the jump density for a technology discovery. So we're talking about a long-term technology discovery. The thing that's on the horizontal action is a potential date of this discovery. It's unknown, but I'm showing you the density over time. That's just given by the blue curve. So here we are focusing on something that's going to pay off decades down the road but potentially not immediately. Now, when you start cranking up this aversion, you're concerned, you're not confident in your specification of those probabilities, you're going to make a cautious adjustment. So what do? You go from the blue, that blue density to the green density. The green density is this uncertainty adjusted one with a modest amount of this aversion, and the red one is if it's much more extreme, that aversion. So if you see this, and you're going to say, well, if this is the case, the more averse you are, you should just do less of it because look, you'll become much more. You're not very confident that the blue is the right density anymore, and things could pay off much later. So typical naive, simplistic finance arguments are going to say, do less of it, just shift out of that investment. So this works against being proactive, and I think that'd be many people's intuition going into this. That's not the whole story. Right? So that story is in there, and that pushes you to do less, to adopt a more cautious view. Is going to say but there's another one. Think about the success. If you make this technology discovery, you just resolved a big chunk of uncertainty, and if you're uncertain averse, that's a really big deal for you. So the payoff. So yes, your views kind of shift to this right, but your payoffs, your potential payoffs here, get much larger if you're uncertainty averse, because what this technology does is it removes a big chunk of uncertainty. This works just the opposite direction. And in a lot of our calculations, it turns out the second force dominates the first one. And this leads you to be more proactive. So this is a case where this uncertainty makes you think about two different effects. One's going to make you be more cautious. The other one's going to say, no, actually, with the success here, really good. This is great if I'm uncertain averse. So we find that the second dominates in a bunch of our calculations, but not always, okay? So here what I'm gonna show you is the knowledge stock valuation and the corresponding R&D investment over output. The C parameter is this penalization parameter. It says if I put C equal to infinity, it says I'm not going to do any exploration whatsoever of my probabilities being, but my baseline probabilities being wrong. As I crank that to smaller and smaller numbers, I'm going to let this minimization step do more and more. That means I'm going to embrace that baseline with less and less confidence. Okay? So I mean, this is really kind of a theory of confidence when we start thinking about these probability models. So it turns out that as you crank far enough, you do eventually, this first force eventually takes over. You do eventually say, well, I'm going to, I know so little about this technology, I'm just going to, it's just not worth it. But there's a whole range here, a very important range under which you want to be more proactive here. So this is, I think, a little bit more subtle aspect of our research, but one that I think is very important, because this gives you a story for why you want to be more proactive, and a counterexample of this notion about, well, you should just be, the more uncertain you are, the more passive you should be, and the less you should do of this investment. Okay. Now let me now take a deeper dive into this rainforest model. Okay? So we're going to go at the rainforest model by having this so-called fictitious planner. So we're going to talk about allocation of land over time and across space in the Brazilian Amazon. We're going to have over 1,000 different locations. The model inputs are going to have to include these productivity estimates of all these different sites. Now the planner is going to face uncertainty about what those productivities are. Okay? But the planner is going to also impose an external price of carbon emissions and the cost of reallocating land. Okay? And then we're going to work out these uncertainty adjustments for the productivities across 1,000 different land sites. So it's a very high dimensional problem. Okay? Now, we're also going to have a baseline problem. What this baseline problem is going to do is it's going to do the following. It's going to say, I'm going to move this price of carbon. I'm going to make it sufficiently low that I can explain what the aggregate productivity of agriculture is now in the Brazilian Amazon. We'll call this kind of a business as usual. So if I set the carbon price low enough, it can accommodate current behavior, and then as I crank it up, it's going to make the carbon capture potential all the more important. Okay? So here are just a picture of all these productivity inputs here. Okay, the one on the left are kind of measures in terms of intensity here of carbon capture. The ones that are more deeply red are the ones in which are better at carbon capture. And then the one on the right, the ones that are very, very red are the ones that are very useful for are the places where agriculture is kind of most productive. Okay? So these are negatively correlated, which means that maybe that should show up, that should have some role in terms of the solution to this model, but they're not perfectly negatively correlated here. Okay? So this is just a picture of all these the inputs we're putting into our model. Now we also make these uncertainty adjustments. Okay, so think about the following. So let's go with this business as usual. Okay, so we're looking at right now Brazil emits lots of carbon because of its use of agriculture. It's emitting a substantial amount of carbon. Okay? So if I'm taking a business as usual specification for this external cost, that the external cost is very low, what's the planner going to care about? What he's really going to care about is the productivity in agriculture, because that's really the most productive use of the land right now, because the cost of the external cost of climate change is low. Okay? And so what that means is that the tilting here, the adjustment, is going to push the agricultural productivity to the left. Okay? And then now what happens when we start increasing substantially this externally inputted cost of carbon emissions? Now, if you push that far enough, what the planner is going to really care about in terms of the probabilities that are accurate now become the ones for the carbon capture. Okay? And the conservative adjustment means that those are the ones that gets moved by our calculation. So these adjustments are going to depend a lot on this, on kind of what the cost is we're imposing for carbon emissions. This is an externally imposed cost, and it's supposed to, this cost is supposed to capture not just the returns to Brazil, although the business as usual one is kind of Brazilian specific. But as I increase that, I'm trying to take into account the fact that if the Brazilian Amazon is absorbing carbon, that's good for the rest of the world. Okay? So the basic insight here is the following. The agriculture currently being done in the Brazilian Amazon is very socially inefficient. In fact, it's less economically efficient elsewhere, including in Brazil. It's just that there's not a lot of other, there's not a lot of other incentives for the people to use land for other reasons right now. So at a low cost, so what we show is at a low social cost, low by what the type of numbers people talk about the social cost of carbon. This has to do with a small amount of external payments to Brazil to incentivize them to shift their land uses. The land allocation gets modified to a nature-based solution for carbon capture. And the numbers required to do this are quite modest. And the reason why they're modest is in part because the agriculture being done in Brazil right now is really low productivity agriculture. So it doesn't take a lot to try to, a lot of economic shifts of economic incentives to substantially change what the prudent allocation is. So what I'm going to do now is, this is a spatial dynamic model. Okay, so this means that when the model evolves, the model is going to evolve over time and in space. So I'm going to show you kind of a dynamic plot of what happens to the land allocation year by year for two different specifications. One, baseline. Okay. Two, I'm going to take the baseline number, add on 15, which the implied social cost of carbon is very, very modest by what goes on in lots of discussions of what that number should be. It's much, much lower. And then I'm going to show you what happens, what the model says for prudent land allocation. So the left one is the business as usual, okay? And what you're seeing here is land allocated to agriculture. Okay. So on the left, you're seeing more and more land shifting to agriculture, actually. In fact, agriculture productivity increases. On the right there, just the opposite. So now we've imposed a higher cost of emissions, but I'd say still a very modest one. And now, eventually what happens is you just start pulling agriculture out of the Brazilian Amazon. So part of what we're trying to argue here is that at fairly modest external transfers, it should be possible to incentivize Brazil to preserve the Amazon. This is just kind of redoing the thing again. Let me just skip through these. So the conclusions I want to get out of this is sometimes the best response to uncertainty is to be more proactive. That's one of the messages that we got out of this technology investment. I also think more generally, more transparent communication of scientific uncertainty can help inform and design better policy. The type of methods we're developing for uncertainty quantification that really, that we're kind of extending them, refining them, and pushing them in a policy direction, I think have much more general applicability to the study of dynamic policy relevant models. Finally, this research is part of a larger agenda to explore the impacts of uncertainty about private and public sector decision making. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks. I'll take questions. If they're really hard, I'll just turn them over to you. Uh-oh.
No.
I'm in trouble now.
No, one comment and a question. The comment is I guess we should have said this earlier, but probably all of you know that Lars got this Nobel in part for his GMM paper, Generalized Method of Moments. In a sense, this reminds me a lot, of course, of that. And I remember how ambitious this sounds. Reminds me of how ambitious that was, in a sense that with all econometric sequence we did. The biggest trick of all was that every estimator could be just a simple version of a GMM model. So like, you've done this before, you're tackling something that is so complex that I think it's quite exciting. The question is, if you had to pick any type of data you would want to start testing to the extent that it's best for this model, what type of data would you pick? What is it that we don't have and that you would love to have?
Okay, so I mean, certainly modeling inputs, and there's more we could do here. I just ours are kind of an illustration. The modeling inputs, and this is where we want to push it now, is to take these R&D investments. There's different types of technologies that down the road can help us with climate change. We can talk about non-nature-based climate capture type technologies. We can talk about energy type technologies like nuclear fusion. We have a colleague in Chicago that wants to shoot aerosols into the atmosphere to temporarily cool things. It'd be useful to think about, to put a bunch of these things on the table with their uncertainties and their potential payoffs in ways that, and then proceed. So that's an area, the potential, trying to assess the potential of the different technologies in a credible way is something that we're anxious to think harder about and been talking to people about. I think we know remarkably little about what's going to happen if we start warming the Earth by about 4 more degrees or 3 more degrees or like. Some climate scientists think the Earth ends, and some or that economic opportunities fall off. There's a whole discussion that shows up. I find a little bit naive. It's called carbon budgeting. First of all, it ignores the fact that there's this uncertainty between emissions and temperature. But it's the damage function implicit to that is if you violate the carbon budget, you go off a cliff. And for economists, we tend to think that, well, there'll be some form of adaptation. Where you're not going to literally go off a cliff, but it's going to have adverse consequences. How do we think about those damages? Lots of things that come into play. It's going to be how will policies respond? How will economies adapt? How will new technologies emerge? Those all come into play in it. So kind of understanding better what the economic opportunities are for warmer, under further warming is very interesting, but I don't think it's an empirical question only. I think because a lot of this is speculation. So it has to do with thinking hard about models and getting credible models. So I guess those are the ones that we're wrestling with. I'm not sure what that has to do with GMM, but I'll ask you about that later. Okay.
So Lars,
Yes.
here.
Yeah, gotcha.
So I'm going to ask something about implementation, right? So in relation to the Amazon problem, because a lot of the deforestation actually takes place in undesignated public forests.
Yeah.
So it's not even clear who we should be paying for, right? And actually implementing a system of payments in that setting without clear private property rights. You could even generate deforestation, right?
Yep.
And the common narrative is that actually a lot of this agricultural, mostly cattle raising activity, right, is not really related to cattle productivity, but actually to stating a claim of ownership over public lands, even without making much money, right? So, and I think these questions raise issues of like translating these numbers that you have into real policy. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah. So it's a very important thing. So this particular paper just uses this external number that we feed into it, the kind of this price of emissions, which is kind of a proxy for different type of potential policy outcomes. Now, I can tell you that price is modest, and which it is. Our calculation definitely shows it's modest. So the amount of resources and potential it would take to address that's modest. The challenge, I agree completely, is how do you do this in ways that you incentivize the use of that money that makes sense. So yes, property rights are part of it. I think that's part of the story for sure. Getting well-assigned property rights. And, we're not going to. People are going to be reluctant to just hand over money to Brazil and say do whatever you want with it because how do we make sure it's used in the way that we need to? property rights are part of it. Well, maybe it's related to property rights. It's also a case that you have to figure out ways to avoid so-called greenwashing. So if you could imagine that, say, well, I'm going to compensate you for the land, for shifting your land from agriculture to growing trees, and then take the next parcel of land and cut that down instead. Or alternatively, you grow trees for 3 or 4 years and cut them down. So there's this long-term commitment issue as well that shows up that's really quite important. For this to really work, there has to be some type of long-term commitment. And Jose's written some stuff about designing certain type of bonds with payoffs down the road that in order to try to ensure commitments that one actually commits to using the land long term for this new activity. So I think these are all really important questions, and there's no doubt that the calculations here don't address them, but I think they are first order questions. There's also some recent research trying to figure out to what extent could carbon markets help you with all this, and how could one to design them in ways that might be fruitful. So I think these are all very, very important questions. I don't think I have a simple answer for you, but I agree that that's left out of these calculations and has to be a part of the actual applied policy. More questions?
Hi. So I understand this is a very complex and dynamic challenge, particularly in the modeling aspect, and I know that it can be easy to criticize or even bring up issues with the model adopted and all these things. But my question to you is, how do you deal with the cost of misspecification of your model, particularly because maybe perhaps investing in R&D and so on may even shift the timeline for a tipping point or other forms of misspecification. How do you think about that when you develop this sort of research?
The cost. So basically, what we're doing is, in some sense, backing out the economic cost of misspecification. Part of the thing that I didn't emphasize it, but probably should have, is when we do our calculations, we have to take a stand on different degrees of aversion, how averse society should be to these concerns about misspecification. So for us, that's a statement. Just like there's risk aversion, this is a statement of a type of aversion. Now, we as economic researchers, it's not our job to tell society how averse they should be to these different forms of uncertainty. But what we can do is show you the consequences of those different aversions. Like, for instance, I had that table that kind of changed the C parameters to a bunch of different magnitudes. And so we can do sensitivity analysis along the aversions. And but then it's kind of useful then, as we change that type of the penalization for misspecification, how does that show up in terms of what the decision maker really cares about, and then what are both the utility consequences, but margin utility consequences, as well as what are the policy consequences. So those calculations are all endogenous; they come out of our calculations. So, but we kind of load in the initial concerns for this misspecification by these penalization parameters, or typically one or two, that kind of narrow the focus of the analysis. Now we can debate whether there's debates about whether we've got the right way to construct penalty functions and stuff like that, and those are very interesting to have. But on the other hand, I can't get up here and tell you how averse society should be to these uncertainties. I can tell you what the consequences of that aversion are. And I think our calculations can provide a pretty refined characterizations of those things. I think that's useful.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation, first of all, Professor Hansen. And I was thinking here, and it's great to see your interest on the matter, but did the results follow your intuition at first when you were dragged to this matter here? or did you have any specific surprises when you started to study and found your results?
So the work I talked about with Mike and Buzz, where we thought it'd be interesting to load in these 4 different channels on uncertainty and see what their consequences are. So that was the ambition of the project. The fact that it came out, this proactive R&D policy popped out was not anticipated. I'm not sure we had a sharp view necessarily one way or the other. And when we first tried it out, we got 2 reactions. It's obvious or it's obviously wrong. And but we got both reactions. The one that was obviously wrong was a statement that, well, we know from options theory that if you increase the variance, it's a good thing because it opens up, more up, it opens up more opportunities in the upper tail of the distribution, which had nothing to do with what goes on here. It's obviously wrong was a statement about, well, this notion that we know from investment theory that if you take an investment and you make one of them, and you crank up the, a typical portfolio problem, and you add to the aversion off of what off of the risky prospect, you do less of it. That was suggested, and that force is in there, but it's not the one that dominates. So that came out as a surprise. We struggled initially about what the best way to actually understand it, and then we kind of hit upon these 2 different competing forces. So that was the model gave us results, and we had to sit back and think about what's driving them. For the rainforest, I think the main thing there was, it's not that we knew that if we made this cost high enough that you would get big reallocations of the rainforest. What surprised us there was the fact it was pretty modest changes, and that the external price led to some pretty big changes in the reallocation. So I'm not sure we would have anticipated those magnitudes.
Professor Lars, first of all, thank you for the presentation. I really think that this topic is greatly important to our future. And my question is, how can greater transparency in communication, scientific uncertainty help build public trust and support more effective decision-making in addressing global warming, particularly in the context of Brazil? Thank you.
So I should first say my 2 co-authors are Brazilian experts, and I'm not. They're also both Brazilian, but they're both expert economists, and can tell you more about what would be helpful to Brazil than I can. I do think that the type of tools we're looking at, this kind of exploration of where productivity uncertainties can matter, and these quantitative calculations is kind of a useful addition to what we're doing, and I think that could be very useful. And I think putting on the table, this comes back to the question I was asking about policy implementation, puts on the table, how can we structure foreign assistance to address rainforest preservation in ways that help Brazil as well as help the world at the same time. And I think that's kind of our aim, is to try to accomplish both of those things simultaneously. So we think kind of taking a more accurate estimate, characterizations of what we know and don't know can give us better informed statements about that challenge. But if you want more concrete advice for Brazil, I will put you in touch with my 2 co-authors.
Hey, Professor, I would like to know if, in your vision, do you think the myths about meeting like COP30 that is happening in Brazil, are they really helpful for the Amazon survival?
The myths about what? I'm sorry, I didn't follow. The myths about? The what? Oh, COP30. Oh, that's great. Is COP30 going to be really helpful for Brazil?
I want to know if global meetings about climate change.
Oh, okay. Well, you know, I've got tenure, so what can they do to me? So, okay, so I'm no expert on the COP meetings. I'm very, very glad that the new president of COP is listening to my co-author, Jose Schenkman, who's his top economic advisor, and I've been involved in some committee advising Jose in terms of what priorities might be set. I think a lot of the previous COPs have not been so successful. I do think that the current composition, the fact that the president of COP is listening so closely to top economists, may well be that we can get more productive stuff out of this one. And I think the opportunity to focus this on kind of the Brazilian rainforest is one of the targets I think can also be helpful. So let's hope it can be productive, but we'll see. We'll see how it plays out. But I'm cautiously optimistic.
Professor?
Yeah.
In what light do you see the lack of faith in intergovernmental institutions regarding the implementation of measures to mitigate environmental damage and the decline of cooperation between nations?
I'm not sure I processed all that. Let's see. So, about institutions that...
Like the UN and
yeah, UN and
the frailty of the institutions
and
right now.
It's really, it's really hard to be incredibly optimistic about political coordination and climate change. I mean, as I said, maybe the most recent COP can be more focused and accomplish something along those dimensions. But I think it's hard to be really optimistic about it. I think this is one of the reasons why I personally think that economists have paid too little attention to the potential R&D solutions, and is that a place where you ought to be making more social investments as a way to address climate change? Because I just think the political arena is far too complex, and it's very hard to be optimistic that any time in the near future there's going to be truly meaningful global cooperation in addressing this important problem. I wish I could be more optimistic about that, but it's. I do think that though, new technologies, looking for better ways to produce stuff and cleaner ways to produce stuff, can be a fruitful way, and to proceed for both developed and developing countries. So that's my best hope for optimism.
Hi, excuse me. I just had a question because I don't really understand how you could, despite you saying that how R&D can bring these great payouts to society and also whoever has discovered them, how could you convince these, well, I guess I'm guessing it could be companies that would be researching them to take this chance on something that's unlikely when there are more guaranteed profits that they can already do?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So the question is, part of this is who should be doing this investment, and that really depends on the different stages of the R&D. There's different stages of the technology. I think if you want to talk about basic research inputs into things, that's going to have to require some type of government subsidies. I don't think the private sector will be incentivized to do enough of it. Once there's more evidence of potential economic viability, then I think a lot of it can be offloaded to the private sector. If you think about nuclear fusion now, there's a lot of venture capitalists that are already jumping into it, even though its prospects are highly uncertain. So it'll be on their radar screen, but there has to be some conviction on their part that this has the potential to be economically viable. So I think the more basic scientific advances have to be subsidized, and then maybe as things become more evident, that should be offloaded to the private sector. I know my government's not a very good venture capitalist, so I don't think in general I don't think governments are the best people at doing that. But anyway. But it's a very important question. Who does it? How much of this is external, and how much can be internalized by the firms? I think it really depends on the stage of the developments.
I was bullied by Emmanuel to ask you a question, or cold, whatever you name it. So, as a not so well put segment to the previous question, let me ask you, and on the interdisciplinary spirit with which you started your lecture, what other, if there are such other players to the discussion, if we are actually missing, do you think should be participating in the debate, be those in academia or the private sector or any other one you can think of?
So the interdisciplinary aspect I've thought of the most is core, the pure academic side. And on that, there's lots of arguments we should be doing interdisciplinary research, but a lot of the interdisciplinary research coming out of the academic community is just not very good. It's stuff stapled together with not very thoughtful integration, and it's hard to do it really well. When it's done well, it can be very important, but it's not trivial to make it happen, because you have to have people in the different disciplines willing to adapt to the other person's language and the other person's priorities, and different communities have different kind of modeling standards and different ways to view what are good and bad models. So it requires some open-minded researchers that really are open to trying to figure out what are the right connections. So it can work, but I think it's hard. I think the other part of your question, maybe the more important one though, is how do we kind of engage the scientific community simultaneously with the private sector in ways that can be very, very productive, which I think, especially when I'm talking about things like technological advances and the like, I think then I think it becomes a really critical question. How much of this do we really need to have scientific investment done by governments, and how much of this is is the private sector already incentivized to do? I mean, they're clearly incentivized to do R&D. So it's and so I think I think it depends a lot on the different technologies and the like, and the ways they can work together is probably different across those pieces as well. But I do think about figuring out ways to encourage kind of private sector contributions to this are very important and probably critical to actually addressing the problem. So.
Professor, thank you very much for your talk. And what do you think about the role of philanthropy, just like catalytic capital, just to try to bring more private capital in this game, especially in deep tech and all of these technologies? Yeah.
Oh, I think private philanthropy can be good. The thing that you have to worry about there and is that it has to be done thoughtfully. I mean, there's lots of evidence of greenwashing and stuff like this, where stuff is just done superficially that accomplishes nothing, and so it's when it's done, you have to make sure it's not done as just some show, instead of it's just done in very meaningful ways. So I actually think it can be a critical part of the solution. But we do have to get better and better to kind of sort out how we can design the philanthropy to be invested in ways that are at the end really accomplish what we need to accomplish. That comes back to the earlier question. Suppose we want to subsidize Brazil to preserve the rainforest. How do we really do that in a meaningful way? So.
Hello, Professor. First of all, thank you for the presentation. And considering that the carbon credit market has been strongly growing, would you say that there is a possibility of this turning into a business more profitable than agriculture, making this more interesting for the private sector than agriculture? What would you say?
So I'm not sure it's one or the other. I do think making carbon markets work better and well can be valuable, but we also have to give people incentives to want to participate in those markets. I mean, do we do it, we're requiring governments, do we do it voluntarily, do we have firms do it voluntarily, or like, what are the right incentives to have participation there? But I do think having well-functioning carbon markets, including ways that we can design this, that we avoid greenwashing, that we can do verification, and that what gets traded is something that's very meaningful. Property rights are identified in kind of the right way. I think we'll be part of the solution. I think it's actually a very important part of the solution, because that can help us, if we get those working well, then that can help us figure out how to channel different type of external contributions to address climate change. So I'm not sure I think about it as one or the other, but I do think getting better functioning carbon markets is important, and there's some interesting economic research that's being done on the ways in which we can do various improvements on this. There's lots of discussions these days on kind of carbon accounting and the like, and how can we really do relevant accounting of like emissions reductions and stuff like that. I think that are very, very important in terms of making things work better.
Thank you very much.
Let's have a round of applause to Lars Peter Hansen. I want to thank you all for your incredible questions and the engagement thus far. I want to invite you now out into the reception hall to continue the conversations with each other, with the other faculty, with Lars as we continue into the evening. One of the things I want to flag, though, is we're touching on issues that build off of and take the next steps after Lars's work that are reflecting the political complexities, the collective action challenges that we face as we're dealing with some of the biggest challenges in the world. I'd like to invite you to come back tomorrow to hear from another one of our professors, Leo Bernstein, as he's going to talk about the social media trap and the sorts of collective action challenges we're all facing in that particular domain. So come back tomorrow, 2:30. He'll be starting to talk around 3 to continue this conversation. One last time, an applause for Lars, and thank you all for coming tonight.